The aim of an issue tree is to take a big open question and then divide it up into smaller questions and yet smaller questions that you can then answer with rigorous research. Now the way we do that is to ask what or how, and I'll show you what I mean with an example. An example that we can all identify with is the question, how can I accumulate more money? Now let's start by thinking of all the things that we could do. To start with, you might, I don't know, you might decide to kill off your granny, for example, and inherit lots of money, if you have one. There's one example, slightly tasteless. You might decide instead to work harder, a new job perhaps. I suppose you could beg off friends, you could sell all your clothes, you could sell your intellectual property. If you had some money, you could invest it. What else? You could also, I suppose, you could try to spend less. I suppose also you could get a second job, depending on whether or not you have the time. Anyway, you can think of lots and lots of things that you could do here. But as we presented it so far, we just have a sort of mess of ideas, nothing particularly cohesive. Let's go back a slide and think about what to do next. We started with our big open question, how can I accumulate more money? And we asked what, or in this case how. Now what we need to do next is to look at the answers that we got by brainstorming and try and divide them up into groups. Now it helps to have 3 groups, but 2 groups or 4 groups is fine. We want to put them into issues. Now I've put 3 here, issue 1, issue 2, issue 3. The key thing is to make sure that these issues are independent and complete. What do I mean by that? Independent meaning that you can do 1 independently of 2 and 3. Now complete, also I want to sort of pick these issues such that I cover every possibility with the 2, 3 or 4 issues that I'm looking at. And we'll find that in order to do that I have to make them quite similar ideas. Now that was the theory. Let's put it into practice by looking back at the things that we had before. Now if we look at all these items, we can see, let's put them into 2 groups. 2 groups seem to spring out. First of all, killing off granny, that's about getting more money. Work more money. Begging off friends, that's about getting more money. Selling clothes is getting more money. Selling your IP is getting more money. Investing is to get more money. Spending less is a different category. This is a saving idea. It's an idea of reducing your expenditure. Getting a second job, that's increasing income. So all of these were about increasing income, whereas this one, spending less, was actually about reducing expenditure. So I can think of 2 categories straight away that are independent and complete. I can either increase income or I can reduce expenditure. So now let's rub all this out and start again with those 2 issues, increasing income and reducing expenditure. Now what I've done is reduce this large open question, how can I accumulate more money, into 2 slightly smaller questions, which are, first of all, how can I increase income, and secondly, how can I reduce expenditure. Now they're independent, I can do one independently of the other, and they're complete. I can't think of anything else that doesn't fall into one of those 2 brackets. And now what I do is concentrate on just one of them and repeat the process. Now I find it can take a long time to do this and to work out how to cut it correctly, so I'm going to jump to a way that I found useful to split the next level down on the increase income side, which is to say, let's see what I can do about my regular income, and let's see what I can do about one-off income. If we think back to what we'd said before, we had things like killing granny, that's obviously a one-off income, or there's in getting a better job or a better paid job, that would be a regular income. But once again we can see that in picking regular income and one-off income, we've got 2 things that are independent. I can change either one independently of the other, but they're also complete. I can't think of anything that doesn't fall into either regular income or one-off income. And now we repeat the process again. So for example we might decide to look at the one-off income. The question is now, it's a little bit smaller than the bigger question we had at the beginning. The question is, how can I increase my one-off income? And again you can sort of divide this up into 2, 3 or 4 little strands. Perhaps another strand might be to think of legal ways you could increase your one-off income and illegal ways. Again, what we find is that those 2 things are independent and complete. I can't think of anything that isn't either legal or illegal. And I think on the illegal side we have killing off granny. On the legal side we have one-off income, things like selling clothes. It doesn't have to be clothes, so in fact let's be more general with that. Let's remove the words clothed, and we'll put in belongings, selling things I have, and now we could break that down into clothes, anything you have to sell on eBay, whatever it may be. But indeed, even there, that might not be the best way to cut it, because by saying selling belongings I've restricted myself. So let's remove the words belongings and think, what could I sell? Well, I can sell a number of things. I can sell my belongings, I can sell services, I could sell my body parts. That would certainly be one off. I've only got a couple of kidneys and I'd rather keep one of them. But the point is that by sort of going through this process, I've taken my big question, how can I accumulate more money, into how can I increase my income, to how can I increase my one-off income, how can I increase my legal one-off income, and then we've got down to this really sort of very tight question, much smaller question, a closed one. How can I accumulate more money by selling various objects? And then I can reduce that down to selling belongings, selling services, and selling body parts. Now this process of dividing the larger question into lots of smaller questions throws up lots of things that you hadn't originally thought of. For example, let's go back to this area here. How can I increase my income, my one-off income, legally? There's more than just selling. Selling implies that I'm giving someone a service or something in return for money. I can also beg. Now we can break that down as well into begging, if you like, on the streets type begging, or asking for money from various trust funds. But there are various ways of taking money as well, perfectly legally. You could wander around the streets and pick up coins that people have dropped on the ground. And these are things that you might not have thought of the first time you set about asking how can I accumulate more money. By dividing the question up into a lot of little questions, these extra ideas come forward. Now you often find in these issue trees that the same branches crop up in different areas. For example, under regular income here, I could also divide this up into legal and illegal, which is the same branch that I had down here on the one-off income. And under legal, I'd have, I won't draw this in, but I'd have things like working more perhaps, and then working for a higher paid job, so working the same amount but earning more money. I might ask for a pay rise or whatever. Under illegal, I might, for example, have blackmail someone, in other words, extract money with menaces, and that would be a perfectly illegal way to get regular income. And you can carry on doing this process, and eventually you get down to a very large number of things on the right, some of which are acceptable and some of them aren't. So let's go back and summarize what we've done. We've taken a big open question, in this case, how can I accumulate more money? We've divided it up into two sub-questions that I call issues, which are independent and complete. In other words, you can do one or the other independently of each other, and they're complete in that you can't think of anything else you could do that doesn't fall into one of those two categories. Then we ask the question, how can we achieve issue 1? And we do exactly the same process down into sub-issue 1A, 1B, 1C, and we continue that process all the way down until we have a whole host of options on the right, some of which will be acceptable and some of which will be unacceptable. The point is that these are very precise issues and they can be tested by hypothesis. And for example, we will be looking later on at testing the hypothesis that we could make money by blackmailing somebody. Now, not all of the options on the right hand side are going to be acceptable. Some of them will be acceptable and we'll look at in more detail. Some of them will be completely unacceptable. Let's go back and think about the next slide. It might be, for example, blackmailing someone might not be something that we want to do. We might not want to sell any body parts. On the other hand, we might decide that we have several belongings that we don't need anymore that we would sell on eBay. So you can have a sort of what we call pruning the issue tree. You can go along and say, I'm not going to do blackmail, I'm not going to sell my body parts, I've only got a few services I'd like to sell, so I'd perhaps break that down further and say some are acceptable, some are not acceptable, but there are some things like selling belongings that I will investigate further. And so by doing this, we've taken our big question, how can I accumulate more money, and we've found a number of things. There might be 10 different issues that we might decide to look into in more detail, but crucially we've looked at many more than 10 different issues, and we've said rationally whether or not we want to do them. Now, to do a good issue tree can take a whole afternoon, if not a whole day, and what I find is that you start off doing one issue tree and cutting it one way, and then after a while realised that there was a better way to do it. And so you tend to sort of rub everything out, start again in a different direction, and sometimes you can find that actually there's another way that you could have cut it. Now, for example, here, the question, how can I accumulate more money, falls very neatly into increase income and reducing expenditure, but the next level down could be all sorts of things. You could have regular income, one-off income, or you could jump straight away into the legal versus illegal, or you could do something completely different. You could jump straight away into, say, a charity, selling stuff, investing, and so on. There's no correct way to do it, but what you find is that after exploring various possibilities, you tend to find one way that works much, much better than another. Now, from the point of view of writing up a report, you can see that you have here now a good structure for that report. Your report might be, how can I accumulate more money? Your first section would be, how can I increase income? Second section, how can I reduce expenditure? Now section 1A, regular income. Section 1B, one-off income, and so on. So we can see a structure developing already for your argument. These things are best learnt by doing them. The theory can only get you so far. So a question that I particularly like is this one. What can we do about global warming? I like it because it's a very, very open question. It has all sorts of answers, and there are lots of different ways that you could divide the answers up into issues. Secondly, it's something that everybody has some knowledge about, and a lot of people have a lot of opinions about it. So it's something that's very good for a group exercise. Now, if you're doing this in a group exercise, indeed if you're doing it alone, I think that a good way to do it is to say, first of all, spend 15 minutes brainstorming ideas. 10 to 15 minutes. Put all the ideas you can think about onto a piece of paper. When you've done that for 10 or 15 minutes and you're beginning to dry up, what you can do then is to group the ideas together into various issues. So try and get them into a number of issues that are, as we said before, they're complete and that they cover all the possibilities, but that are also independent. You can do one independently of the other. And remember, every time you're asking, from your big question here, you're asking what or how. And then when you get down to this first issue, you're repeating the process. You're asking, what can I do here to achieve this process, this second issue here. Now, the process of dividing up your big question into some slightly smaller questions can often throw up more ideas. For example, you might be down at this third issue here, and you might just at the moment have one idea coming off it, but in the process of thinking, how can I achieve this thing here, it's a slightly smaller question, you might think of other things. And indeed, in thinking of other things, you might realise that you've missed a whole area that's actually quite important. So then you can often go back and think, actually this area here is quite important, I'm going to move it up the issue tree to here. And that often means changing everything around, making another issue tree with three different, or cut in a different way with three different issues at the top end here, breaking down into similar ideas later on. Now, that process can take anything from 20 to 30 minutes. Indeed, if you're doing it really properly, it would probably take you a whole afternoon. What's interesting is to do it with lots of different groups, and then the third stage of this process is to compare groups. Compare the ideas of different groups. And what you find, if you do, typically we'll do 24 groups at the same time, you'll find 20 different ways of cutting this, some of them very, very different from others. And indeed what you can do then is say, having compared the groups for another 20 minutes, say, then you can go back in stage 4, every group redoes their issue tree. Now, very briefly on the next slide, I'm going to show some ways I've seen people divide this that are good and some that are bad, and then a way that I think is particularly good that comes from an accumulation of lots of other people's ideas. So the question is, the big open question, is what can we do about global warming? Now, I've seen this divided into increase absorption, meaning of CO2, and then into reduce emission of CO2. Now that straight away, those are two quite good things. I think they can come a little bit further down the issue tree, as I'll show in a moment. But then the third thing that this group has was a line that says an issue that said political. To start with, I'm not quite sure what that means. I think they meant sort of a group action forced by politicians. But the point is that these three issues here are actually not very similar. The first two are similar to each other, but the second one is completely different. It's not the same type of thing. We've got increasing absorption of CO2, reducing emission of CO2. You can imagine those being independent and complete. Anything falls into one of those two branches. But political is just a completely different concept. And so we can see that these issues, which have to be independent and complete, in order to do that, you often have to make them very similar ideas. Often you can make them opposites. They tend to be independent and complete. But to put in three things that are somewhat different leaves gaps, if you like, or there are things that are political that could fall into the reducing emissions of CO2 bracket, for example. So that was a bad choice of a third item to put on there on that branch. Now I'll erase this and show another cut that I saw that I rather liked, but I think was rather simplistic. And this group said, very profoundly, we can do something or we can do nothing. These opposites are a very powerful way of making two issues that are independent and complete. They're independent because they're opposite, they're complete because everything you can think of falls into the bracket of doing something or doing nothing. Now what I think they really meant was that we can do something to combat radiative forcing from the sun, or nothing to combat radiative forcing from the sun, and think more about mitigation. Now this branch here is something that, when I run this course, people often miss completely. It's only when they see another group thinking about doing nothing to combat global warming that they suddenly think, oh yes, there are all sorts of things we can do on this area of mitigation. So now I'm going to rub this out and start again, thinking of sort of bringing these ideas together and thinking of a better way to divide this big open question into a couple of issues. Now when people think about global warming, they, I think, automatically think of CO2. But this, of course, is only one global warming gas. Equally, there are other gases that can actually cool down the Earth by increasing its albedo effect, its reflectivity. So what can we do about global warming? We want to cut this up in a way that doesn't stop us thinking about other things later on, other issues. So try and keep it as general as possible. I rather like the idea of doing something or nothing. Now perhaps another way to put that is to say either we're going to reduce the radiative imbalance from the sun's radiation, or we're going to deal with the consequences of a radiative imbalance. Let's think about the first one then. Now the question is, how can I reduce the radiative imbalance from the sun? Now this is the more conventional way. You might decide to reduce greenhouse gases. That's the way that most people will start off thinking. But another thing you can do is increase, call them anti-greenhouse gases. And for example, SO2 up in the stratosphere increases the albedo effect of the Earth, the reflectivity. Now you can think about this for a moment. Increase anti-greenhouse gases, well, you've got SO2 in the stratosphere, you've got particulates, and so on. You can imagine now asking the question, how can I increase the anti-greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? And you've got a whole raft of issues over here that you might not immediately have thought about. Now, reducing greenhouse gases, we have more than just one greenhouse gas. We have things like CO2, we have ozone, we have methane, all sorts of things that, again, they're independent and complete. You can change the CO2, you can change the ozone, you can change the CH4. There'll be other gases as well that you could change. SF6 is another example. You can do all sorts of things here. That this is the conventional way of doing it, if you like. Well, most people will think about CO2, but there are other gases as well you can try to change. And within those, now we're getting onto the cut we had originally, we can have things like production and absorption. So this idea of producing or absorbing CO2, although it's very important, is only one of many things you can do. And by re-expressing this question, this large open question, what can we do about global warming, and really thinking about all the various options, we've seen that it's actually this CO2 business is only coming much later on, and there are many other things you can do beforehand that fall under the reducing the radiative imbalance. Now we ask the question, how do we deal with the consequences of radiative imbalance? And now we get into all sorts of things about building flood defences, moving coral, I don't know, moving people around. But these are ideas down this area of the Rishi tree that we might not have thought of otherwise. Now you can continue this process for a long, long time, and like I say, it takes probably an afternoon, if not a day, to do a really good issue tree. And then afterwards you'll have a whole raft of options down the right-hand side, some of which you'll find acceptable, some of which you won't. You might, for example, say it's completely unacceptable to pump sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, even worse, to pump particles into the stratosphere. On the other hand, you might say, yes, we do want to do something to reduce our production of CO2. We do want to do something to reduce the amount of methane in the atmosphere, for example. But the point is that by doing this process, you've at least looked at every possible option on the right-hand side, of which there'll be certainly probably about 20, maybe even as many as 100, and then you'll have selected the 5 or 6 to take for further analysis in what I call a hypothesis tree.